I'll only say that those countries, like the Soviet Union, which have tried to run everything from the center, are now learning that success depends upon dispersing power and decisions away from the center. And it would be absurd for us in Europe to move in the opposite direction. A centralized European government would be a nightmare.
On the street, a warm public reaction.
I love you dearly. Lovely to see you.
But less than lukewarm politically. Yesterday, the Belgian minister, Mr. Tindemans, described her refusal to toe the line as acting like de Gaulle. Did you regard that as a compliment?
Well, General de Gaulle was quite a formidable personality. It's certainly not an insult.
But it was not a compliment, and indeed Mrs. Thatcher is not receiving many of those from her fellow EEC leaders. This evening she was asked why they disagreed with her.
Because they tend to talk in generalities. You hear it very frequently in European speeches. You must have heard it many times. And I think I'm one of the few people who says, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by European Union? What do you mean by monetary union? What do you mean by United States of Europe? What do you mean? What do you mean? The Delors proposals would abolish the pound sterling and all other national currencies in favour of a single currency run by a European central bank. That institution would control our interest rates and monetary policy, and Brussels would control our budgetary policy. It's ironic, at a time when Eastern Europe is moving towards greater democracy, that some in the community want to take economic and monetary policies away from our national parliaments and hand them over to a body which is not democratically accountable. Anyone who read the debate in the House of Commons the other day will realize how strong is the resolve in all parts of the House not to give up Parliament's sovereignty in matters which are so central to its very existence.
Mr. Speaker, is it not clear to the Prime Minister that what the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry has said to the Spectator cannot be unsaid, and that therefore he can have no place in her cabinet?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend has expressed his very great regret and unreservedly withdrawn his remarks.
Mr. Speaker, hasn't the Prime Minister made it clear with that reply that the only way in which the right honourable gentleman can stay in the cabinet is because his views are her views?
No, Mr. Speaker, those views which have been withdrawn did not represent the government's views or indeed my own views. They did not represent the government's views.
But, Mr. Speaker, is it not the case that when, under the terms of collective responsibility, as everybody understands them, a Secretary of State expresses views strongly and graphically that are contrary to the views of the government, that Secretary of State is sacked? Will the Prime Minister not recognise that what the right honourable gentleman has said is not just deeply offensive to our allies and partners, but deeply damaging to our country's interests, and he must go?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend has...
Order! 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 The Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend has expressed his very great regret and unreservedly withdrawn his remarks. They do not represent the government's view or indeed my own.
I have always understood that it is the custom of this House, when remarks have been apologised for and unreservedly withdrawn, and
Order. Prime.
unreservedly withdrawn, Mr. Speaker, as they have in this case, that withdrawal is gracefully accepted.
The real significance of the Trade and Industries Minister's comments this morning was that it reveals a deep and irreconcilable split on Europe in the Cabinet, which is now damaging Britain's interests, causing confusion in Britain's government's policy, and causing contempt for Britain abroad. Does she not realise that if she will not sack him, she condones him, and that her government remains in shambles for as long as he remains a member of it?
No, Mr. Speaker, those remarks did not represent the government's views or my own, and I have to say to the right honourable gentleman that Britain's influence and Britain's reputation were greatly enhanced at the Houston summit by the spirit of cooperation which we showed and by the efforts we made, in fact, to bring about a successful communique at the end of that summit.
The Secretary of State for Department of Trade and Industry's track record.
Order. Dawn Primarolo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State for the Department of Trade and Industry's track record of insensitive and outrageous statements on a number of issues is well known. Can the Prime Minister tell the House whether there is anything that the Secretary of State could say that would actually get him the sack?
Mr. Speaker, I have indicated quite clearly that my right honourable friend has unreservedly withdrawn his remarks.
Order.
When remarks are so unreservedly withdrawn, to accept that withdrawal gracefully. My right honourable friend can hardly...
Order. A few moments ago I had to rebuke the government benches. Now I must say to the opposition, they must let the Prime Minister have a fair say on this.
Right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, as I thought the right honourable gentleman knew, is still in Hungary.
About the Germans were leaked to the press this week. In addition, members once again questioned Mrs. Thatcher about former British Trade Minister Nicholas Ridley, who resigned last weekend after making anti-German remarks in a magazine interview.
As the Prime Minister chose in the exchange of resignation letters to refer to the policies we both believe in so deeply, doesn't she owe it to this House and the country, and she was the one who mentioned honour, Mr. Speaker, doesn't she owe it to the country to say whether she repudiates the view of the former Secretary of State expressed in his resignation letter that the proposal of the European Commission for economic and monetary union in the community would be a disaster? Does she repudiate him, or does she agree it would be a disaster?
Mr. Speaker, the policies that the Secretary of State, ex-Secretary of State and I agree on are the policies which have transformed Britain to what Labour left it as, and how we have recreated it. The honourable gentleman cannot have listened to what I said last week. My then right honourable friend's view were not the views of the British government. I should have thought you would indeed have known that. With regard to the resignation letter, my right honourable friend condemned the move to a single currency. Is Labour now supporting that? Mr. Speaker, the summary of the documents for the forthcoming Luxembourg Council, and I have not seen the full documents, they came too late, and I share the views of those who protested that they were not available. The summary reveals a quite different destiny for Europe than any we were ever given to expect when we went in. They are proposals for a federal union. They call for a common foreign security and in due course a common defence policy in which majority voting would apply. They call for a great extension of community powers and competence in energy, in health, and over labour laws, again often with majority voting. May I say one thing at this stage of majority voting? We've had some experience of the extension of that voting in the Single European Act. I suggest that we are very careful before we consider extending majority voting any further. The fact is that majority voting means that we give the community the right to impose on the British people laws which this House, its elected representatives, may fundamentally disagree with. That's a very serious step to take. And the document also calls for a central bank to set monetary policy leading to a single European currency. The Times has referred to all of this as supranationalism run riot. And my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, declared in this House on the 18th of June, a European superstate would not be acceptable to me or to the House, and in my judgment, it would not be acceptable to the Council. I wholeheartedly agree with both the Times and with my right honourable friend. Few of us will forget what Mr. Delors told members of the European Parliament in 1988. In 10 years' time, 80% of economic legislation and perhaps even fiscal and social legislation will be of community origin, he said. That is the road he wants us to take, and it is the road that we must resist. It repeated earlier commitments to economic and monetary union while attempting to define it only as economic and monetary cooperation. What is now being considered is a massive extension of the community's powers and competence into almost every area of our national life and that of other member states. It will be the greatest abdication of national and parliamentary sovereignty in our history. Some people argue that the changes envisaged in the draft treaties on the table in Luxembourg would not actually happen for many years, so that there's no need to worry. But that is a very dangerous approach, because once these powers were given away, they would never be taken back. The firm stand, which I quoted my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, the firm stand they have taken against any commitment to a federal Europe. And I would hope that most people in this House were against a federal Europe. Otherwise, what is the point of standing as candidates at the next election? Come back here and you propose to hand over all your powers to represent your constituents to another parliament.
Order!
Mr. Speaker, we should not. Second point, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. We should not let those who support a federal Europe pretend that they are somehow more European than the rest of us. They are not. They're just more federal. Specifically European about a federal structure. Indeed, the opposite. It is the nation-state which is European. Third, Mr. Speaker, we should not for one moment fall for attempts to argue that a federal Europe would mean a devolution of powers. If that were the case, why change what we have at present? Powers are devolved, in that they are held by national parliaments and government as they should be. For Monsieur Delors to say that his proposals would mean devolving powers is ridiculous. They are not his or the community's to devolve. Our sovereignty does not come from Brussels. It is ours by right and by heritage. We choose what we devolve to the community, not the other way round. Now, the fourth consideration, which I hope my right honourable friends will have in mind, is the danger of being drawn along by what start out as vague commitments but end up as highly specific and damaging proposals. There's a much greater willingness in some European countries than in Britain to sign up to great rhetorical statements and declarations without worrying too much about what they will mean in practice. And it's welcome that as some of the earlier declarations of intent have been committed to treaty language, a number of governments, not just ours, have become more worried about the practical consequences. Such is the case with the Social Charter, and moreover, some are now seeing that a single currency could not possibly work with the disparities between European economies as great as they are now, and that setting the goal of a single currency has no relevance to Europe's current economic problems. Moreover, may I please finish this section? Moreover, to go to a single currency is not just a practical matter, it is a fundamental question of principle. It is not only a merger of currencies, it is to give up for all time the right of the banks of England and Scotland and our Treasury to issue our own currency, backed by our own economic policy, answerable to our own Parliament. That is why I do not believe in a single currency. Mr. Chairman, you have invited me to speak on the subject of Britain and Europe. Perhaps I should congratulate you on your courage. If you believe some of the things said and written about my views on Europe, it must seem rather like inviting Genghis Khan to speak on the virtues of peaceful coexistence. I want to start by disposing of some myths about my country, Britain, and its relationship with Europe. And to do that, I must say something about the identity of Europe itself. Europe is not the creation of the Treaty of Rome, nor is the European idea the property of any group or institution. We British are as much heirs to the legacy of European culture as any other nation. Our links to the rest of Europe, the continent of Europe, have been the dominant factor in our history. We in Britain are rightly proud of the way in which, since Magna Carta in the year 1215, we have pioneered and developed representative institutions to stand as bastions of freedom. And proud, too, of the way in which for centuries Britain was a home for people from the rest of Europe who sought sanctuary from tyranny. And we British have in a very special way contributed to Europe. Over the centuries, we have fought to prevent Europe from falling under the dominance of a single power. We have fought and we have died for her freedom. Only miles from here in Belgium lie the bodies of 120,000 British soldiers who died in the First World War. Had it not been for that willingness to fight and to die, Europe would have been united long before now, but not in liberty, not in justice. It was British support to resistance movements throughout the last war that helped to keep alive the flame of liberty in so many countries until the day of liberation. And it was from our island fortress that the liberation of Europe itself was mounted. And still, today, we stand together. Nearly 70,000 British servicemen are stationed on the mainland of Europe. All these things alone are proof of our commitment to Europe's future. The European community is one manifestation of that European identity, but it is not the only one. We must never forget that east of the Iron Curtain, peoples who once enjoyed a full share of European culture, freedom and identity have been cut off from their roots. We shall always look on Warsaw, Prague and Budapest as great European cities. Nor should we forget that European values have helped to make the United States of America into the valiant defender of freedom which she has become. The community is not an end in itself.
nor is it an institutional device to be constantly modified according to the dictates of some abstract intellectual concept. My first guiding principle is this: willing and active cooperation between independent sovereign states is the best way to build a successful European community. To try to suppress nationhood and concentrate power at the center of a European conglomerate would be highly damaging and would jeopardize the objectives we seek to achieve. Europe will be stronger precisely because it has France as France, Spain as Spain, Britain as Britain, each with its own customs, traditions, and identity. It would be folly to try to fit them into some sort of identikit European personality. Some of the founding fathers of the community thought that the United States of America might be its model. But the whole history of America is quite different from Europe. People went there to get away from the intolerance and constraints of life in Europe. They sought liberty and opportunity, and their strong sense of purpose has, over 2 centuries, helped to create a new unity and pride in being American, just as our pride lies in being British, or Belgian, or Dutch, or German. But working more closely together does not require power to be centralized in Brussels, or decisions to be taken by an appointed bureaucracy. Indeed, it is ironic that just when those countries, such as the Soviet Union, which have tried to run everything from the center, are learning that success depends on dispersing power and decisions away from the center, there are some in the community who seem to want to move in the opposite direction. We have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level, with a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels. Let Europe be a family of nations, understanding each other better, appreciating each other more, doing more together, but relishing our national identity no less than our common European endeavor. Let us have a Europe which plays its full part in the wider world, which looks outward, not inward, and which preserves that Atlantic community, that Europe on both sides of the Atlantic, which is our noblest inheritance and our greatest strength.
NATO has been a great success, and we should be wary of creating new institutions to replace or complement its unique and indispensable role. Perhaps the most extraordinary suggestion yet to come out of Brussels is that the disunity and half-heartedness of most European nations during the Gulf crisis demonstrate the need for a united European foreign and defense policy. For many years, successive American governments believed that progress towards the United States of Europe would relieve America of the burden of defending freedom. That hope, alas, turned out to be greatly exaggerated. Moreover, this kind of geopolitical grand strategy should be regarded with the greatest skepticism. If a European superstate were to be forged, it would almost certainly develop interests and attitudes at variance with those of America. We would thereby move from a stable international order with the United States in the lead to a more dangerous world of new competing power blocks. This would be in no one's interest, least of all America's, and certainly not of Europe's. Now, may I say a word about Europe, more than I have said? The European community's response to the challenges and opportunities of free trade will be crucial. Europe is now at the crossroads. Amid the apparently technical arguments on monetary union, institutional change, and the social dimension, a struggle is underway for Europe's future. Only recently, perhaps, America has begun to recognize that it too has a stake in the outcome. A democratic Europe of nation-states could be a force for liberty, enterprise and open trade. But if creating a United States of Europe overrides these goals, the new Europe will be one of subsidy and protection. The false political mission which some would set for the European community is to turn it into an inward-looking and protectionist United States of Europe. A Europe in which individual nations, each with its own living democracy, will be subordinated within an artificial federal structure which is inevitably, as you know, bureaucratic. For a community lacking a common language can have no public opinion to which the bureaucrats are accountable. Americans and Europeans alike sometimes forget how unique is the United States of America. No other nation has been created so swiftly and successfully. No other nation has been built upon an idea, the idea of liberty. No other nation has so successfully combined people of different races and nations within a single culture. Both the founding fathers of the United States and successive waves of immigrants to your country were determined to create a new identity. Whether in flight from persecution or from poverty, the huddled masses, with few exceptions, welcomed American values, the American way of life, and American opportunities. And America herself has bound them to her with powerful bonds of patriotism and pride. The European nations are not, and can never be, like this. They are the product of history and not of philosophy. You can construct a nation on an idea, but you can't reconstruct a nation on the basis of one. Political institutions can't be imposed if they are to endure. They have to evolve, and they have to command the affection, loyalty, and respect of populations living under them. And they have to be accountable to the people. Our kind of Europe, of sovereign states, proud of their national identity, enjoying the prosperity which free enterprise brings, a force for open trade, democracy, and liberty, would look outward to the world, where freedom must be defended and extended. And when we look westward, we see not threatening rivals, but staunch friends with common purposes. That's my vision of a European future. As someone who believes in Britain, in our identity and our institutions, our history and our destiny, I reject the notion that we should effectively cease to govern ourselves and pass more and more powers over to European institutions and non-elected bureaucracies. I also take this opportunity to warn the people of the United States, as I have done on other occasions, that the agenda which the European federalists have set can't be pursued without damaging American interests and ultimately jeopardizing harmonious international relations. It is only by staying united that the West, that is America and Europe together, can ensure that we are the dominant influence in global affairs. And that matters because we are the authors and spreaders of liberty and a rule of law. And that must be our goal. The European federalists, who still find much support among European politicians, though less among European peoples, aim to create a United States of Europe with its own government, currency, foreign policy, and defense forces, which can only be, and is intended to be, a rival to the United States. I don't believe you can create one nation from 15 different countries with 15 different histories and 13 different languages. So I propose that Britain first negotiates its way out of those aspects of the present financial arrangements with Europe, which bear particularly heavily upon Britain. that we act to protect our parliamentary and legal sovereignty, that we declare openly against a single currency, and that we urge the creation of a North Atlantic free trade area covering North America and the European community, which would underpin NATO and reverse European protectionism.